Imagine spending your entire life thinking the rule book you were handed was just this cold legal contract.
Right, like a literal list of do's and don'ts.
Exactly, just right and wrong. But then you suddenly discover it was actually a desperate centuries-long love letter.
Oh, that completely changes the paradigm.
It does. That the whole time, the greatest problem facing humanity wasn't about broken rules at all, but rather, well, a broken home. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, today we are looking at a text that makes exactly that claim. You, the listener, provided us with a stack of fascinating sources. We've got a profound theological treatise and a highly detailed accompanying infographic.
Both titled Paradise and Fellowship by Chris R. Velasquez.
Yes, and our mission today is to just tear this wide open. The core argument here is that the entire biblical narrative, from the very first ancient page to the apocalyptic ending, isn't about, isolated religious experiences.
Or just moral management.
Right. It is exclusively about one single central relationship. It's about God relentlessly pursuing a dwelling place with humanity.
It completely reframes how we interact with these ancient texts, honestly. Because when you approach a historical or theological document, the temptation is to view it as an encyclopedia.
Oh, for sure. You just want the facts.
Yeah. You want to categorize it, look up a specific doctrine, put it on a shelf, and walk away unchanged.
Like checking a box.
Exactly. But what we are unpacking today refuses to stay safely tucked away in the past. I mean, it demands to be understood as the active, vibrating reality of your life right now.
So to see why that is,
Yeah.
we have to look at how this source material connects to the very real, very human experience you and I have every single day.
Yeah, if you look at the top of the infographic you shared with us, there's a section titled The Longing of the Human Heart.
I was just looking at that. It features 5 distinct icons.
Right. Peace, belonging, beauty, meaning, and home.
Those are massive. I mean, if you really stop and think about it, you could categorize essentially every single human pursuit under those. Every drive, every anxiety, it all falls under one of those 5 headings. We literally exhaust ourselves chasing those 5 things.
We do. And what the treatise argues is that every time you feel that restless ache, that sudden, inexplicable pang for a place to belong.
Or like the desperate search for meaning in your career.
Yes, or even that weird, quiet sadness that creeps in even when your life is supposedly going perfectly well.
Oh man, I hate that feeling.
Right, but the text says that feeling is actually a memory. The author pulls in this famous concept from Augustine.
What exactly?
He essentially said, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you."
Wow.
So the text synthesizes this by arguing that this universal human misery, this constant itch we just can't scratch, isn't just a chemical imbalance in the brain.
Or bad luck in the universe.
Exactly. It is a residual collective memory of a lost intimacy in Eden. And simultaneously, it's an anticipation of a promised new creation.
Okay, let's unpack this because that is a wild thought. You're saying that the feeling I get when I'm, say, staring out the window on a rainy Tuesday, feeling inexplicably homesick.
Even when you're sitting in your own living room.
Right. I'm already home.
Oh.
But the reason I feel that is because I am actually spiritually homesick for a reality my ancestors lost.
Exactly. The ache is the evidence of the design. I mean, you don't crave food unless your body was designed to eat, right?
Right. That makes sense.
So you don't crave belonging and unhindered presence unless you were fundamentally engineered for it. The author is suggesting that this core fellowship is the baseline of human existence.
And its fracture is the source of all our modern restlessness.
Completely.
So if we want to understand how we ended up in this restless state, like how we lost the baseline, we really have to trace the timeline laid out in these sources.
And this is where it gets so expansive.
It does. The infographic and the treatise map out a narrative arc that literally spans from eternity past to eternity future. We aren't starting at year 0 here.
No, we are starting before the concept of years even existed.
Right, which brings us to the first major conceptual shift the author introduces. The source looks at eternity. Specifically, the fellowship of the Trinity.
And the text is incredibly explicit about this. Before the creation of the universe, God was not lonely.
Which is such a massive misconception.
Oh, hugely.
I feel like the default pop culture assumption is exactly the opposite of that. People think, God was floating around in the dark all by himself.
Terribly bored.
Yeah, terribly bored and profoundly lonely, so he made humans to keep him company, like a cosmic pet.
But this text entirely rejects that premise. It points out that God is eternally Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Meaning there is this eternal communion, right?
Exactly. Eternal love and eternal fullness already happening before a single star is ever formed.
Okay, that is a crucial foundation.
The author brings in references like John 1.1, noting that the Son is with God in the beginning, and Genesis 1.2, where the Spirit is hovering over the waters.
So the mechanics of this are vital. Fellowship is not an afterthought.
No, it's not a remedy for divine isolation. It is rooted in the very structure of who God is. If God is fundamentally love, there must be a lover, a beloved, and a spirit of love shared between them.
From all eternity.
Right. Therefore, God did not create humanity out of a deficit. He didn't create you to fill a void in himself.
It's like someone hosting a massive, lavish dinner party.
Ooh, I like that.
I always think about it this way. You don't spend 3 days cooking a 7-course feast, setting a gorgeous table, and inviting all your friends over because you're desperate, sad, and lonely.
Well, hopefully not.
Right? If you're doing it right, you throw a lavish dinner party because your joy and abundance are so overflowing that it simply cannot be contained.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
You have so much good food, so much great wine, and so much happiness that you just have to pull chairs up to the table and share it. You want others to sit down and participate in the abundance you already possess.
That is a perfect way to visualize the mechanics of creation according to this text. The triune God creates out of overflowing generosity.
Not out of lack or neediness.
Right. Creation is an explosive act of love extending goodness outward. And because that is the origin story of the universe, it means human fellowship is directly patterned after this eternal divine fellowship.
So the reason you are a relational being, like the reason isolation literally damages human psychology, is because the creator you reflect is fundamentally, eternally relational.
Exactly. And that brings us right to the creation of humanity in Genesis 1 and 2, which introduces the Garden of Eden.
And I have to say, the source material completely blew my mind on this specific point.
I thought it might.
Yeah, the author argues that Eden wasn't just a pleasant botanical park with some nice fruit trees and friendly animals. The text refers to it as a cosmic temple. It was a sanctuary.
This is where we have to peel back our modern assumptions and look at the ancient Near Eastern context that the author is drawing from.
Because when we hear garden, we think of, like, a community park.
Right. But in the ancient world, temples were often designed as lush gardens. They were the specific interception points where the realm of the gods overlapped with the realm of humanity.
Oh, okay.
The text argues that Eden is the original prototype for every temple that comes after it. It is the sacred space where heaven and earth are perfectly locked together.
Okay, but how does the text back that up? Because I don't remember any stone altars or stained glass windows in Genesis 2.
Well, it comes down to the mechanics of the original language and humanity's role within that space.
Okay.
We usually picture Adam as a landscaper, right? Trimming hedges, naming the giraffes, maybe pulling some weeds.
Oh, nuts.
But the treatise argues his role was far more profound. He was a priest king.
A priest king? So that sounds like a massive leap to me. How do you get from a guy tending a garden to a high priest?
The author points to the specific mandate Adam receives. God tells him to work and keep the garden.
Okay.
In Hebrew, those words are abad and shamar. What's fascinating here is that if you fast forward in the biblical narrative, those exact two Hebrew words are used together almost exclusively to describe the sacred duties of the priests serving in the tabernacle.
Wait, really? The exact same words?
Yes. Their job was to abad serve and shamar guard the holy place. So Adam is not a gardener, he is a guardian of sacred space.
Oh, wow.
He is mediating the presence of God, expanding the borders of this cosmic temple into the wild earth.
That completely shatters the flannel graph Sunday school picture of Eden. It's not some retirement community. It's a dynamic, holy environment specifically engineered to facilitate unbroken communion with the Creator.
Exactly.
And that changes how we have to understand the image of God, right?
Right.
The text spends a lot of time on Genesis 1.2627, where humanity is made in God's image.
It does. And let's clarify what that actually means, because people often assume being made in God's image just means humans have like higher intelligence or moral reasoning.
Or opposable thumbs.
Right. But the author compares humanity to the rest of creation. Animals are complex and beautiful. Angels are terrifyingly powerful. But only humans are explicitly described as bearing the image of God.
Okay.
The text argues that this image is fundamentally about having a unique built-in capacity for communion.
Meaning we are designed to be a mirror. We reflect God's rule to the earth, and we reflect the earth's praises back to God.
Precisely. It establishes us as covenant partners. The treatise makes a brilliant point here. Knowing God and having fellowship with Him isn't some optional spiritual enhancement you add to your life.
Like a meditation app or a new hobby.
Exactly. It is the very fulfillment of your fundamental design. A human being without communion with God is like a bird that refuses to fly. It's a betrayal of the architecture.
To illustrate what this unbroken communion actually looked and felt like, the text zeroes in on one highly specific phrase from Genesis. They were both naked and were not ashamed.
Yes, that phrase is so important.
Now, on the surface, that just sounds like a biological fact about the garden. But the author pulls incredible psychological weight out of this. It's not just about clothes.
Not at all.
It represents total, absolute vulnerability without any fear. It is complete openness without the slightest hint of regret.
Think about the mechanics of shame for a moment. Why do we hide? Why do we curate our social media or bite our tongues or put up emotional walls?
Because we're terrified.
We do it because we believe that if people truly saw every part of us, our flaws, our weaknesses, our selfish thoughts, we would be rejected or destroyed.
But in Eden, before the fracture, there is nothing to hide.
Right. The author states that the most profound sign of paradise is not the abundance of food, but the unhindered presence of God.
When God walks in the garden, it implies a regular, casual, deeply personal pattern of fellowship.
You could exist in front of the creator of the universe completely exposed and feel nothing but profound safety.
It's an unbroken reality. Work isn't a chore, it's meaningful worship. Relationships have zero friction. But then we hit Genesis 3.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the devastating transition in our timeline. The narrative shifts from this unhindered, joyful presence to a catastrophic, world-breaking rupture. This is the fracture of trust and the birth of shame.
And this is the part of the source material that explains the world as you and I currently experience it, the tragedy of the fall.
I really want to push back on the traditional understanding of this, because the text has a very specific and frankly counterintuitive take on the serpent's tactic in the garden.
It really does.
The author argues that the serpent didn't just tempt Adam and Eve to break a random, arbitrary legal rule about a piece of fruit. The true temptation was to sever trust.
Yes.
So I have to ask you, is the author really arguing that sin is fundamentally a relational rupture rather than just a legal violation? Because we are so conditioned to think of sin as just crossing a line in a rule book.
The author is absolutely asserting that it is relational at its core. If you just look at it as a broken rule, you miss the entire psychological mechanism of the fall.
Okay, explain that.
What's fascinating here is how the text maps out the linear sequence of what actually happened. The fall doesn't start with someone's teeth sinking into a piece of fruit.
No.
It starts much earlier with a subtle whisper of distrust.
How does that actually work? Mechanically. Like, how does a conversation with a serpent unravel the entire cosmic temple?
Let's break down the psychology of a lie. Imagine a child who trusts their parent completely. The parent says, "Don't play near the busy road."
Makes sense.
The child obeys, not because they feel restricted, but because they trust the parent's love and wisdom. Now imagine someone pulls that child aside and whispers, "Your mom doesn't want you playing near the road because she hates your freedom.
Oh, wow.
There are amazing toys out there, and she is keeping them from you so she can control you."
Okay, so the moment the child believes that lie, everything shifts.
Exactly. The rule hasn't changed, but the relationship has.
The moment the child believes the lie, the rule is no longer seen as protection. It is perceived as a prison.
And the parent is no longer a loving protector. They are a withholding warden. This is exactly what the author says the serpent does.
The serpent whispers that God is withholding good, that obedience is actually a loss of potential.
And that autonomy from God is true freedom.
So the sequence the text outlines makes perfect sense. First, there is the distrust of God's character and word.
Right.
Second, once you don't trust God, your desire becomes detached from obedience. You start craving the thing that is forbidden because you think it holds the key to your happiness.
Exactly. And third is the physical act of rebellion, taking the fruit.
And fourth is the inevitable result, profound alienation.
The rupture is relational before it is legal, though the text is clear that it is absolutely a legal and covenantal violation as well. They broke the treaty.
But they broke the treaty because they first broke the trust. And the physical and psychological consequences of that broken trust are instantaneous. The text notes how violently the environment shifts.
It's immediate.
The moment their eyes are open, that beautiful innocence turns into crushing shame. The total vulnerability we just talked about turns into a frantic, desperate need to cover up. Unhindered fellowship turns into hiding in the bushes.
The author draws a terrifying contrast here. Before the fall, the human posture is open, secure, and trusting. After the fall, the default human posture is covered, fearful, hidden, and suspicious.
Sin fractures every dimension of relationship simultaneously, doesn't it?
It really does. They are alienated from God. They hide from his presence. They are alienated from themselves. They feel shame about their own bodies.
And they're alienated from each other. I mean, Adam immediately blames Eve.
And they are alienated from creation itself. The ground is now cursed and will produce thorns. The instinct to hide, to construct walls, becomes the defining characteristic of the human race.
It's incredibly bleak. But right in the middle of that disaster, the text points to a stunning detail. God enters the garden, and he asks a question. Where are you?
Yes, that is such a key moment.
Now, wait a minute. We are talking about an omniscient, all-knowing creator. He obviously knows exactly which fig bush they're cowering behind. So how does the treatise synthesize that question? Why ask, where are you, if you already know?
This is a linchpin moment in the author's entire thesis. The text insists that this is not a question of divine ignorance, it is an act of divine pursuit.
Divine pursuit, okay.
When you realize someone has betrayed you, the natural human instinct is to withdraw, to cut them off, or to immediately drop the hammer of justice.
Right. Just walk away.
But God's first action post-fall is to go looking for the people who just betrayed him. Humanity runs, God seeks.
So he's not gathering geographical information.
No, he is extending a lifeline. He is forcing them to articulate their hiding. He is opening a dialogue of mercy.
And that dialogue leads to what theologians call the proto-evangelium, the first gospel, right there in Genesis 3.15. It's the promise that the offspring of the woman will eventually crush the head of the serpent, even while the serpent strikes his heel.
The text points out that while fellowship is deeply, perhaps irreparably broken in this moment, it is not abandoned by God.
That promise sets the trajectory for the entire rest of the Bible. The whole narrative from here on out is the long, bloody, incredibly costly road back to fellowship.
Which introduces a massive theological problem and transitions us into the next phase of the timeline, the era of covenant, kingdom, and exile.
The problem is this. How does a perfectly holy God maintain any kind of relationship with a fractured, rebellious, contaminated humanity without utterly destroying them in the process?
Right.
Because I want to pause and push back on this idea of holiness, because I think it trips a lot of people up.
Oh, definitely.
If God is infinitely loving, and he wants this fellowship so badly, why doesn't he just dial down the holiness? Why can't he just say, you know what, water under the bridge, come on back into the garden, let's just hug it out?
It seems like the easiest solution, right?
Doesn't the strictness of his holiness contradict the idea of wanting a warm relationship?
It's a great question, and it's one the modern mind struggles with immensely. But the text is very clear. God's holiness isn't a setting on a dial that can be turned down. It is his very essence. Imagine the sun. The sun is incredibly life-giving. It provides the warmth and energy that sustains all life on Earth.
Right.
But if you try to bring a corrupted, fragile piece of matter right into the core of the sun, the sheer, intense purity and power of the sun will instantly incinerate it.
So the sun doesn't hate the object?
No, its nature is simply incompatible with darkness and corruption. In the same way, God is the source of all life and purity. Sin is anti-life. It is corruption.
So if infinite purity collides with unatoned corruption, the corruption is destroyed.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense mechanically. So God wants to dwell with them, but if he gets too close to their sin, his own perfect justice and purity will consume them. So how does the text say he bridges that impossible gap?
Through a mechanism called a covenant. The author defines a covenant as a formal, divine instrument where a holy God intentionally binds himself to a sinful people through promises and blood.
So he essentially sets up a legal and relational framework that allows him to dwell among them safely.
Right, and you see this thread pulled through the stories of Noah, Abraham, and the formation of the entire nation of Israel.
The text notes a specific phrase that keeps repeating like a heartbeat throughout the Old Testament. I will be your God and you will be my people.
Yes.
He also calls this fellowship language. It proves that the ultimate goal wasn't just to give the Israelites a nice piece of real estate or to make them a military superpower.
The real estate was just the venue. The goal was communion.
But that communion, because of the holiness issue we just discussed, creates immense, palpable tension.
It does, and the author explores this tension vividly through the architecture of the tabernacle and later the temple.
The theological reality of the tabernacle is absolutely stunning. You have this camp of thousands of flawed, rebellious, grumbling Israelites wandering in the desert, and right in the dead center of their camp, the infinitely holy creator of the cosmos pitches his own tent to live among them.
The proximity is wild.
I always try to visualize this because it's such a visceral setup. It's almost like having a VIP guest living in your house, someone of such intense, blinding purity.
Right.
And you realize that you and your house are so profoundly contaminated that you have to wear a full-blown, lead-lined hazmat suit just to approach their room.
I love that analogy.
The nearness is absolutely there. They are in your house. You can see the smoke and the fire. But the distance is simultaneously overwhelming. You can't just walk in and give them a hug.
If you casually stroll into their room without the hazmat suit, you will die.
Exactly.
That hazmat suit analogy perfectly captures the terrifying tension of Old Testament worship. Access to God is no longer like the unhindered walks in the Garden of Eden. It is heavily, heavily mediated.
There are thick curtains, there are specific clothes that must be worn.
There are complex rituals of washing, and above all, there are endless sacrifices. Blood is constantly flowing.
The text specifically highlights the Day of Atonement as the ultimate proof of this tension. Why is that day so critical to understanding this?
Because the Day of Atonement proves the underlying mechanics of fellowship. On that one day a year, the high priest representing the people enters the Holy of Holies where the presence of God dwells.
But he cannot enter without the blood of a substitute.
Exactly. The author is making a profound point here. Fellowship with a holy God requires holiness, but holiness exposes our sin. Sin defiles the space, and justice demands a penalty for rebellion.
So a substitute must die to pay the debt of the rebellion.
And its blood is used to symbolically cleanse the space so God can remain. The author states it plainly. Israel's sacrificial system teaches that fellowship with God is unspeakably precious, but it is not cheap. It costs life.
But even with all that blood, even with the hazmat suits, the system is fundamentally fragile.
Very fragile.
The text follows this tension into the era of the kingdom. Israel gets kings like David and Solomon. They transition from a tent to a magnificent permanent temple in Jerusalem.
And the author notes a fascinating detail about that. The temple was deliberately decorated with garden imagery.
Like carvings of trees, pomegranates, gold, cherubim.
Yeah, it was architecturally designed to be a massive physical callback to Eden. It was a sign that God desires to restore paradise.
But the author is quick to point out the fatal flaw in this entire era. The kingdom is fundamentally unstable because the human kings are unstable.
Exactly. David, the man after God's own heart, falls into grievous, murderous sin. Solomon, the wisest king, compromises his devotion and builds altars to other gods.
So the monarchy, according to the text, reveals a desperate, glaring need. Humanity needs a righteous king whose fellowship with God is actually perfect and unbroken. Because when the king fails, the nation falls.
Which leads directly to the ultimate tragedy of the Old Testament, the exile.
Babylon invades, the people are slaughtered or dragged away in chains, and the beautiful temple, the cosmic garden, is burned to the ground.
But the author says we can't just look at the exile as a geopolitical disaster.
No, the text insists that exile is covenantal rupture made visible in human history. It is the exact mirrored opposite of paradise.
God had said, if you break the trust, if you give your worship to idols and fill the land with violence, I cannot dwell here and you cannot stay in my presence.
The land literally vomits them out because the holiness has been violated. Exile is the physical manifestation of spiritual alienation. It is humanity being driven out of the garden all over again.
But crucially, the text notes that exile is not the final word.
Right in the darkest, most hopeless part of history, these prophets emerge. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And they start promising a new covenant.
They realize that a stone temple and animal blood aren't enough to fix the human heart.
Right. They prophesy a day when God will provide a cleansed people, a completely renewed heart, and that the very Spirit of God will be poured out.
They are anticipating a day when God's presence won't just return to a building, but will actually inhabit and transform the people themselves.
And that anticipation acts like a giant funnel. The entire Old Testament covenant structure, all the failures of the kings, all the blood of the sacrifices, points toward a single, unavoidable conclusion.
Humanity cannot save itself. They need a mediator from the outside.
Which brings us to the most pivotal moment in the timeline. We move from prophecies to the arrival of the Messiah. Here's where it gets really interesting.
I agree.
Because the text introduces Jesus using a very specific title from the prophet Isaiah, Immanuel.
Immanuel, which translates directly to God with us. Think about the mechanics of the incarnation based on everything we've just discussed.
Okay.
The author is arguing that God doesn't just send down a rescue manual. He doesn't just shout instructions from the clouds, and he doesn't just send another prophet to get killed.
He actually comes himself.
The Creator steps into the creation. The infinite God takes on human flesh and bone. The Son enters the human exile to personally bring humanity home.
The treatise uses a brilliant title for Jesus, the true and better Adam. I want to dig into that comparison because the text lays out the parallels so clearly, and it really changes how you read the Gospels.
It does. When you look at this through Philosophus' framework, you realize Jesus is essentially acting as a cosmic do-over for the human race.
Let's talk about how that actually looks.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is showing how Jesus systematically reverses the curse of the fall at every single level.
Think about the testing of Adam versus the testing of Jesus.
Yeah.
Adam was placed in a lush, perfectly secure garden with every need met, and he failed the test of trust.
Right. But Jesus, at the start of his ministry, is driven into a desolate, starving wilderness for 40 days, surrounded by wild animals, and tested by the very same adversary.
And in the midst of starvation and isolation, Jesus prevails. He perfectly trusts the Father.
And once he steps out of the wilderness, his entire ministry is a display of restored fellowship.
The text points out that when Jesus touches a leper, someone who is ritually unclean and banished from the community, he doesn't become unclean. His purity cleanses their disease.
When he eats meals with tax collectors and prostitutes, he is actively breaking down the walls of alienation.
The author says every healing, every restored sight, every forgiven sin is a literal foretaste of the restored communion of Eden.
Jesus is living out humanity exactly as it was originally meant to function. Perfectly obedient, perfectly dependent, completely pure.
But the author is clear that being a good example isn't enough to solve the problem of the hazmat suit.
No, it's not. The climax of the narrative and the central pivot point of human history, according to the source, is the cross.
The text argues that the greatest obstacle to our fellowship with God wasn't just the physical distance of our exile. The true barrier was the reality of our guilt.
As we established earlier, God's perfect justice cannot simply ignore sin. The debt of rebellion has to be paid, or justice is a mockery.
And this is where we have to dive into the profound, almost incomprehensible paradox of the cross. The text uses the concept of substitutionary atonement. Let's break down the actual mechanics of that, because it's a heavy theological term.
Think of it in terms of legal debt. If you owe $1 billion to a bank and you are completely bankrupt, the judge cannot simply say, "I'm a nice person, so I declare your debt forgiven."
That would ruin the bank and violate justice.
Right. The debt exists and must be settled. But if someone of immense infinite wealth steps into the courtroom and says, "I will transfer their entire debt to my account and I will pay it in full from my own funds,"
then the judge can legally declare you debt-free while perfectly upholding justice. The law is satisfied and mercy is granted simultaneously.
And the author maps that perfectly onto the cross. Jesus, the sinless Son of God, who has enjoyed eternal, unbroken, perfect communion with the Father since before time began.
Right.
He willingly takes the entire crushed, rebellious, toxic weight of human sin upon himself. He acts as the ultimate substitute.
The text states that on the cross, fellowship is both judged and restored. Jesus enters the ultimate, terrifying reality of exile. He experiences absolute God-forsakenness.
That's why he cries out in agony, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
The infinite fellowship of the Trinity experiences a rupture so that our rupture could be healed.
The innocent substitute bears the devastating condemnation so that the guilty rebels can be welcomed into communion.
The text points to a very specific physical detail that happened in Jerusalem at the exact moment of Jesus' death to illustrate that the mission was accomplished. It's the tearing of the temple veil.
Yes. Remember that massive, incredibly thick curtain we talked about in the tabernacle?
The one that represented the hazmat suit? The barrier keeping the unholy out of the Holy of Holies.
The moment Jesus dies, the Gospels record that this veil is violently torn in two, from top to bottom.
It is the ultimate architectural statement. The barrier is gone. The debt is paid.
The author emphasizes that this unhindered access to God is secured not by humans finally figuring out how to achieve moral perfection, but entirely by the substitutionary atonement of Christ.
The blood of the true sacrifice has cleansed the space once and for all.
But a dead substitute can't bring you into fellowship.
Right. And that's why the text doesn't stop at the cross. It states that the resurrection is the absolute confirmation that the payment cleared.
If death is the ultimate exile, the ultimate separation, then the resurrection proves that the exile is over.
Death itself has been undone from the inside out. The risen, breathing Christ is the prototype, the first fruits of a brand new creation.
So, with the veil torn and death defeated, that brings us right to the present day. Where does this leave you, the listener, sitting in your car or at your desk right now?
Because if we look around, we are obviously not back in the pristine Garden of Eden, and we certainly aren't in eternity yet. There is still sickness, betrayal, and death.
This tension is exactly what the author maps out in a chart on the infographic labeled Now and Not Yet. We live in the overlap of the ages.
The kingdom has been inaugurated by Jesus, but it has not yet been fully consummated. We are living in the era of the church. But I want to be really careful here because the text is hyper-specific about defining what the church actually is.
Yes, because in modern culture, church often just means a building on a corner or a social club with some religious overtones.
Or a nonprofit organization.
Exactly. The author violently rejects that definition. The treatise calls the true church an inaugurated community. And the defining characteristic of this community is that the Holy Spirit of God actually indwells the believers.
Think about the magnitude of that shift. In the Old Testament, the intense presence of God was locked inside a stone temple in Jerusalem behind a thick curtain.
Now, because of the cross, the believers themselves become the temple. The sacred space is walking around on two legs.
That is a staggering reality. It means the pursuit of God's presence isn't geographical anymore.
You don't have to make a pilgrimage to a specific city. The presence is residing within the restored community.
The text also brings up the practice of the Lord's Supper, or communion, to highlight this. It argues that when believers gather around the table to take the bread and the wine, it isn't just a grim, sad memorial of a bloody death.
No, it is a literal, joyful rehearsal of paradise restored. It is a tangible taste of that future kingdom banquet we talked about.
The author stresses that the church is meant to be a preview trailer for the coming kingdom.
The hostility of the fallen world, the bitter divisions between races, classes, and political factions, is meant to be actively dismantled in this cross-shaped community.
When the world looks at the church, they should see a tiny, imperfect, but very real ecosystem where Eden is beginning to bloom again.
So, practically speaking, what does this actually mean for your daily life? The treatise dedicates a substantial section to practical implications, pulling these massive theological concepts down to Tuesday morning reality.
Because if the ultimate goal of the universe is fellowship with God, it changes how you view everything. Let's start with daily living.
The author breaks this down brilliantly. If your primary identity is a restored covenant partner, then your 9-to-5 job is no longer just a secular grind to pay the bills. Work is redeemed.
Whether you are writing code, sweeping floors, or raising toddlers, your work becomes a holy vocation lived before the face of God, just like Adam in the garden.
Furthermore, the text addresses suffering. Suffering is not removed in the now and not yet, but its nature changes.
It becomes bearable because you have the unbreakable promise that God is near to the brokenhearted in the midst of it.
And it completely reframes the core human problem of loneliness. We talked about those 5 icons at the start.
Right. If you feel isolated, the text says the definitive answer isn't necessarily finding a romantic partner or getting more friends, as good as those things are.
The definitive answer is the blood-bought promise of his presence. You belong to the Creator.
The text also delivers a scorching critique regarding leadership, specifically within the church, but applicable everywhere. It states that Christian leadership must be cruciform.
Meaning it must be shaped by the self-sacrificial nature of the cross.
I want to read a specific line from the text because it hit me so hard. Leadership that disrupts fellowship is anti-pastoral, however successful it appears.
Wow.
That is a massive indictment of our modern obsession with metrics.
It forces a total reevaluation of what we consider success. We tend to celebrate leaders who can gather huge crowds, write best-selling books, and build massive empires.
Even if they leave a trail of bruised, manipulated, and broken relationships in their wake, we write off their toxic behavior as the cost of being a visionary.
The author says absolutely not. If the entire point of the biblical story is restoring fellowship, then a leader who sacrifices people to achieve a goal is actively working against the gospel.
True leadership guards and nurtures communion. If you are using people as stepping stones, you are building Babylon, not the New Jerusalem.
That leads directly into the text's view on discipleship and worship. The author argues that our gatherings aren't about religious efficiency.
It's not about how smoothly the music transitions or the production value of the lights.
Or even just accumulating more theological trivia in your head. The goal is transformed communion.
The author says approaching worship should feel like approaching holy ground, because that is exactly what it is. You are entering the presence of the King.
But the story doesn't end in the present tension. There is a final horizon. This brings us to the ultimate climax of the deep dive, the ultimate homecoming.
We live in the already, but what exactly is the not yet? Where's this massive redemptive arc finally going to land?
To get to the final destination, the text refuses to skip over the heavy, uncomfortable themes. Specifically, it tackles the reality of final judgment.
And I'll admit, judgment is a topic most modern people want to avoid entirely. It feels harsh. It feels unloving.
But the author makes a really compelling philosophical argument. Without judgment, paradise is impossible.
Let's follow the logic on that. People often say, if God is love, he should just let everyone into heaven, regardless of what they've done or whether they want to be there.
But the text points out that this idea reduces paradise to mere sentimentality. If God just shrugs and gives unrepentant evil a free pass into the new creation, it invalidates the whole concept of justice.
Imagine a paradise where abusers, tyrants, and unrepentant manipulators are allowed to continue their behavior unchecked.
It wouldn't be paradise. It would just be a continuation of the exact broken, traumatic world we live in right now.
Exactly. The Holy God cannot allow a cancer cell to inherit the new creation, or it will destroy the new creation.
Judgment is the necessary surgical removal of all evil, all exploitation, and all rebellion from the universe. It is God's fierce love for his creation finally saying, enough, I will not allow my world to be vandalized anymore.
The text also briefly touches on the concept of the millennium, a period of the righteous reign of Christ openly manifested in history.
While the author acknowledges there are many differing theological debates on the exact timing and details of this, the core point is profound.
Human history does not end in random, meaningless chaos. Christ's reign will publicly vindicate his people on the stage of human history and bring ordered communion out of the chaos.
And once the judgment is complete and history is wrapped up, that leads to the breathtaking finale, the new creation.
And the author highlights a massive conceptual shift here that fundamentally challenges how popular culture views heaven.
Right, because if you ask the average person on the street what heaven is, they'll usually describe humans turning into angels.
Floating on fluffy white clouds as disembodied spirits, playing harps for 1 trillion years in a sterile white room.
It sounds incredibly boring and utterly detached from everything we love about being human.
And frankly, some people think the goal is just to hit the rewind button and go back to being naked in the Garden of Eden, but the text says both of those ideas are wrong.
The author draws heavily from the final chapters of the Bible, Revelation 21 and 22, which describe the descent of the New Jerusalem. Notice the language. It is a city garden.
God does not scrap the physical universe and replace it with a spiritual void. He redeems and renews the physical earth. It is resurrection-shaped.
The progression is incredible. Eden was a raw, uncultivated garden. It represented innocence.
But the new creation is a bustling, cultivated city garden. It represents innocence that has matured through the fire of redemption into glorified, unbreakable holiness.
And here's the most crucial difference. In Eden, there was the possibility of a fall. The serpent was allowed in the garden. Human innocence was fragile.
But in the new creation, the text says the curse is permanently, eternally removed. The gates of the city are always open because there is no longer any threat.
Humanity is brought to what was always intended from eternity past. Secure, permanent, unbreakable fellowship that can never be lost again.
And what does that fellowship actually look like? The author explicitly states that the ultimate promise of this new creation isn't the golden streets or the pearly gates or even reuniting with loved ones, as beautiful as that will be.
The pinnacle of the entire biblical narrative is found in Revelation 22.4. It simply says, they will see his face.
The highest possible blessing in the universe is the unmediated, unveiled, physical presence of God himself.
Think about Moses hiding in the cleft of the rock, terrified to see God's glory. Think about the high priest trembling in the hazmat suit behind the thick veil.
Now, the redeemed humanity looks directly into the face of the Creator with zero fear, zero shame, and perfect belonging. It is the end of all hiding.
It is the ultimate homecoming.
Now, before we wrap up, the author includes a rapid-fire section clearing up 4 specific dangers and misunderstandings regarding these concepts. Let's tackle these quickly because they are incredibly relevant to how we live today.
Okay, let's do it.
The first danger is reducing fellowship to fleeting emotional feelings.
This is a huge trap in modern spirituality. The text argues that true fellowship rests on the objective reality of the covenant and the finished work of Christ, not your fluctuating moods.
If you base your spiritual security only on how vivid your emotions are, or how moved you feel during a song, you will be constantly unstable.
Your foundation must be the anchor of what Christ has done, regardless of how you feel on a Tuesday.
The second danger is treating paradise as an anti-material escape. We just touched on this, but it bears repeating.
The author says Christian hope is not about escaping your body to become a ghost. It is bodily, physical, and cosmic renewal.
Matter matters to God. He created it, He called it good, He took on human flesh, and He is going to resurrect it.
The third danger is separating grace from holiness. The text warns against the modern tendency to treat grace as a casual cancellation of moral seriousness.
Unhindered fellowship isn't cheap access that lets you live however you want. It is a costly, blood-bought access that demands and actively creates a radically holy, transformed people.
Grace doesn't leave you in your sin, it rescues you out of it.
And finally, the fourth danger: making church community optional. The author argues that if fellowship is the central beating heart of reality, you cannot treat the physical, messy gathering of believers casually.
It isn't a podcast you can just listen to in isolation. It is the present physical sphere where the communion of the coming kingdom is practiced.
You cannot claim to love the head of the church while ignoring his body.
Which brings us to the profound conclusion of the author's sweeping panoramic argument.
Right. To summarize this massive redemptive narrative, the infographic uses the visual of a redemptive wheel. It maps out the cycle we just traveled.
God creates in love, humanity falls in distrust, God binds himself through covenant, Christ redeems through the cross.
The Spirit restores the community, and ultimately, God renews the cosmos. The treatise argues that the whole story, from the cosmic temple of Eden through the terrifying bloody sacrifices of the tabernacle, to the dark agony of the cross, and finally to the blinding light of the New Jerusalem, is entirely about God's relentless heart to dwell with his people.
The deepest prayer of the redeemed human heart isn't just to get out of hell or to escape pain or to get a mansion. It is to be brought home to God.
The author summarizes it perfectly. Salvation is not simply a place you go. It is a person you are united to. God himself is the ultimate inheritance.
That is so well said.
The text tells us that our ultimate destiny is an unmediated, physical, face-to-face reality with a person in a renewed, tangible world. So looking at all of this, it raises a fascinating, provocative question for our modern lives.
What's the question?
How does this cosmic trajectory reframe our current obsession with trying to build our own tiny paradises right now? Think about it. We're desperately trying to curate a sense of peace and belonging through isolated digital connections, hyper-realistic virtual realities, or by aggressively hoarding material wealth and status.
Are we exhausting ourselves, working our fingers to the bone, just to settle for a counterfeit, isolated, lonely Eden, when our DNA was actually designed for the ultimate, shared, unending reality of the New Jerusalem?
That is the exact question the text forces you to answer. What are you actually longing for when you look out that window?
It's something to think about the next time you feel that ache.
Thank you for sharing these brilliant sources with us and joining us as we unpack them. We hope this deep dive gave you a completely new lens on an ancient narrative. Keep asking those massive questions, keep pushing for the truth, and we will see you on the next deep dive.